All right, so let's go through a quick week one lecture quiz review. Just it'll cover various parts and concepts of that we covered in week one. So chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 from the lecture portion of anatomy. So remember that anatomy, right? It's like per the definition, right? So anatomy is going to be the study of the structures, right? For example, like human anatomy is the study of the structures of the human body. So it can be the structures of the external structures or the study of the internal structures, right? But it's really looking at, well, what does it look like versus like physiology, for example, like we mentioned. And so physiology is a study of the function. So what does it do, right? And so when we're looking at anatomy, we're studying the structure, what it looks like, right? So there's gross anatomy, so things that we can see with the naked eye. And for example, gross anatomy would be like systemic anatomy. Systemic anatomy would be the study of the organ system of the body. So for example, I'll give you cardiovascular system, right? Cardiovascular system includes the heart, right? The blood, right? And of course the blood vessels, right? So that's a whole systemic system. That's the whole cardiovascular system. You see what I mean? And even if we did like the urinary system, right? The urinary system would consist of different organs such as the kidneys, right? Those ureters, right? That bladder, for example, right? So it's multiple things really that's making up this one system, okay? And then we also have microscopic anatomy. Microscopic anatomy is stuff that we just simply can't see with the naked eye. We need to use some type of magnification, so we use typically like a microscope. Typically in the lab, we'll use like a light microscope, right? And so, gotta remember, right, these key things. So, ology means the study of, cyte means cell. So, cytology means simply the study of cells, right? So, remember that cytology is the study of cells, whereas histology is the study of tissues, okay? Remember the different parts of the body too, right? So we have an anterior view right here, and we have a posterior view right there. Remember the different parts, okay? Also, remember, whenever we're discussing the human body, we're going to reference it in anatomical position. So this right here is anatomical position, right? You're standing with your feet flat on the floor. Boom. The hands are at your side, as you can see. Boom. And the palms are facing forward. They're facing anteriorly, right? So this is anatomical position. Again, standing with your feet flat on the floor, hands are at your side, and your palms are facing forward, okay? Remember anatomical position. So remember the different anatomical directions as well, right? So proximal is going toward the attached base, whereas distal is going at a distance. It's further away, right? So you can think of proximal at a proximity, it's closer. Distal is at a distance, it's further away, right? Lateral is away from the midline, whereas medial is toward the midline, okay? And we know that superior is going up, whereas inferior is going down, okay? We know that the front is going to be anterior or ventral. That's the front. And the back, right, is going to be posterior or dorsal, okay? I recommend writing them down, right? That tends to help, okay? Also, remember these sectional planes, right? So if we was to, study a certain part of the body and we wanted to look at it a certain way, right? So we have a frontal or a coronal plane, right? So we're cutting them right there, right? And so that frontal or that coronal plane, remember that it's going to be able to separate the body, right? Separate the anterior and the posterior portions of the body. So you're going to have a front and you're going to have a back, okay, of the body, using that frontal or that coronal plane. And remember both terms, frontal or coronal. We may use either or, okay? But again, you're going to get a front and a back. Now, a sagittal cut, like right down the middle right there, so you're going to basically going to get a left and a right part of the body. And then a transverse cut right there, you're going to get a superior, like a top portion, right? And you're going to get an inferior, which is going to be a bottom portion of the body. Okay. We also talked about those body cavities. So we have a posterior body cavity, which is just the cranial and the spinal cavity. That's going to be the dorsal cavity, so that's in the back. And then we have the anterior or the ventral body cavity. That's going to consist of the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. But notice right here, this diaphragm is this dome-shaped muscle that's going to separate the thoracic from the abdominal pelvic cavity, all right? Remember that diaphragm is going to separate the thoracic from the abdominal pelvic cavity, okay? Also, we talked about, for example, in the thoracic cavity, right? We have like the pleural cavity. We also have the pericardial cavity, right? So if we was to look, for example, at this pleural cavity or this pericardial cavity, I like how they have the heart right here because you can see the serous membranes, right? And so these serous membranes, you have an inner layer right here that's directly on the organ right here. That's the visceral layer, right? Visceral means organ. So that visceral layer is going to be directly on the organ. And then we're going to have this outermost layer, that's going to be that parietal layer, right? So remember these two layers of these serous membranes, okay? Okay. Okay. There we go. So remember the cell too, okay? So remember the different parts of the cell, right? Remember that the mitochondria is able to make ATP, right, for the cell. ATP is that energy source that we use, right? The Golgi apparatus is there to package, right, and transport proteins. Okay, that nucleus is going to be important because it's going to house that genetic information. So we're going to have the DNA and the RNA in there. This is the instructions for the cell, basically. And then we also have, like, for example, the rough ER, right? That rough ER, then we have the smooth ER. The rough ER is going to have these dots on it. These dots are going to be these ribosomes, right? These ribosomes are going to be on there. And whenever, remember, we're making these associations. Whenever we think of ribosomes, we know that ribosomes are going to be important for protein synthesis, right? This is where those proteins are going to be made. Remember that, please. Okay, one of the most important concepts. Also remember that lysosomes are these going to be these organelles, right? As you can see right here, but they contain like these digestive enzymes in there, and so they're going to be important for like digesting old cellular debris, even digesting like pathogens if it gets inside the cell, right? So we can break that pathogen down so it won't cause harm. And then we have this plasma membrane, or that cell membrane that's going to surround the whole cell, acting as a barrier. And so I wanted you to look at it right here. This is that cell membrane right here, right? This is the cell membrane, okay? That cell membrane is going to be a phospholipid bilayer, okay? It's going to be a non-polar structure, right? But it provides a physical barrier from the outside and the inside of the cell. It also regulates the exchange of material within the environment, right? And it exhibits sensitivity, so it responds to changes in that extracellular fluid. And it also provides cell-to-cell communication, right? Those glycolipids, right? Those glycoproteins, those are important for cell-to-cell communication, right? Those proteins are important for adhesion, also structural support. Remember these functions of the cell membrane, okay? Also, we did talk about how the cell membrane is selectively permeable, right? So if it was impermeable, nothing could pass. If it was freely permeable, anything could pass. But our cell membranes are selectively permeable, so it only allows certain things in and certain things out, right? But, so when we understand that, I should say, there are some things that can easily go in and out, right? So some things will simply diffuse, in and out of the cell. Right? And typically things that will diffuse in and out of the cell, number one, it needs to be non-polar, right? Or it could be like a small type of gas for example. So for example, right here we have CO2 gas, or like oxygen gas or whatever, right? Understand that this is a passive process. This is a passive process. Passive processes do not require ATP. It doesn't require energy, right? Or extra energy, okay? It just happens normally. It happens freely. We should say passively, okay? So we have simple diffusion. We also have things like facilitated diffusion. That's also another passive process. But understand the definition of diffusion, right? Understanding that, yes, these are passive processes. Diffusion is simply the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, right? So you can see in this example right here, there's a lot of CO2 inside the cell, right? And it's not that much outside the cell. So it wants to move to where there's, not that much of it, right? So it's going to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Diffusion talks about molecules, okay? Osmosis talks about water, right? Water. Make that association. Whenever we're talking about osmosis, we're really just talking about water, the movement of water. So osmosis is going to be defined as the diffusion of water, right, down its concentration gradient. So we're going to move from an area of high water to an area of low water concentration, okay? That's what osmosis is, okay? And osmosis is the movement of water. Water wants to move where there's stuff at. So look how there's a lot of solutes out here. Right? There's a lot of solutes outside, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 inside, right? But there's so much more outside. But again, water wants to move where there's that higher amount of stuff at. So for example, if that was salt, right? If these solutes were salt or glucose or something like that, water wants to move where there's stuff at, okay? And so that's why you'll see that water will move from an area of low solute concentration to an area of high solute concentration, okay? I also mentioned, obviously, when we said it earlier, osmosis is the movement of water from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration, okay? So we also have these other processes, right? And these are called these active processes, or these active transport. And this is where we're using energy. We're using energy because we're probably going to be moving molecules against their concentration gradient, okay? So in an opposing direction of where they typically would just normally go, okay? And so some types of active processes where we're using energy, right, is endocytosis. Endocytosis is bringing something in the cell. So there's different types of endocytosis. There's penocytosis. Penocytosis, think of fluid, right? Peno means fluid, right? So we're bringing in fluid inside the cell, okay? Again, we're bringing in fluid inside the cell, penocytosis. Phagocytosis is eating, so we're bringing in solid particles. And then we also have receptor-mediated endocytosis. And this is where a molecule will bind to a specific receptor on the cell membrane, and it triggers the endocytosis. It triggers it to become in a vesicle, basically. But remember, these are types of active processes. And again, like I mentioned, passive processes are like diffusion, facilitated diffusion, okay? Another type of active process is exocytosis. Exo means out of, right? So we're releasing something out of the cell. And again, this is an active process, so it's going to use ATP, okay? So remember the 4 types of tissues, right? So we talked about that. Remember these 4 types of tissues. We have epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue. Remember those 4 types of tissue, right? Epithelial tissue are going to cover or expose surfaces. Connective tissue is basically that packing material that's going to fill the internal spaces. Muscle tissue is going to be able to contract, produce movement, right? And then we have nervous tissue. That's going to be able to conduct electrical impulses as well as carry information. Okay, but remember those 4 different types of tissues in the body. Remember the different type of glands when we're looking at epithelial tissue, right? So we have these different type of glands, these eocrine glands. These are, or like we can call them merocrine glands, right? So these glands these are going to be the most widely distributed sweat glands that we see. And so they're also an example of a type of simple coiled tubular gland, right? These are simple coiled tubular glands, okay? We also have apocrine glands and holocrine glands as well. Remember the different functions of the integumentary system, right? So the integumentary system, right? So your skin, right? Your nails, hair, things like that, right? And so protecting you from environmental hazards, right? Synthesizing, storing lipids, coordinating immune response, sensing information, making vitamin D, excreting waste, and regulating your body temperature, right? So remember these functions of the integumentary system. And so the integumentary system, so I'm going to focus specifically right now on the cutaneous membrane. The cutaneous membrane being the skin, right? That's going to consist of the epidermis and the dermis. Epidermis is going to be the top layer, right? So it's going to be multiple layers, right? And we know that if it's multiple layers, it's going to be stratified, okay? And then we have the dermis, right? So the epidermis, you got to remember, epidermis is made up of epithelial tissue. The dermis is made up of connective tissue. So remember, epithelial tissue plus connective tissue, it makes a membrane, right? That's why it's called the cutaneous membrane, okay? Epidermis is avascular, right? It's going to get its nutrient supply from the dermis, okay? There's two layers of the dermis. You have the papillary layer, which is that top layer, and the reticular layers, which is below. Let's go through it in a second, though. Again, like I mentioned, there's two different types of layering of epithelia. There's simple epithelium, where it just has one layer, right? Simple, just one layer of these cells, okay? And then you have stratified epithelium, and this is where you have multiple layers, right? Two or more layers, right? They're just packed on top of each other. So remember that stratified is two or more layers. And also remember that you're going to find these in places where you're going to be experiencing mechanical or chemical stresses, right? For higher protection, right? So that's the different type of layering. We also have three different type of shapes. We have the squamous or the squamous shape. That's that flattened type of shape. We have the cuboidal, it looks like a cube. And we have the columnar, it looks more cylindrical, right? So it's longer than it is wide. Right? And that just goes over these different shapes right here that I mentioned, okay? So remember the different types of secretions that we have. We have exocrine secretions, right? So remember, exocrine secretions will have their secretions travel through a duct. Endocrine secretions will secrete their products directly into the blood or the lymph. And those endocrine secretions are going to be hormones, okay? We also have other types of glands, right? Mammary glands, these are special types of apocrine glands, right? And we also have ceremunious glands, right? These are going to be found like in your ear canal, right? And so they're going to produce cerumen. And remember that cerumen is going to be earwax, okay? And that's going to, again, protect you, right? It's going to provide some type of protection, some minimum protection, right, in your ear, especially against like microorganisms and things like that. When we're looking at the skin, remember that the epidermis, right, is a type of epithelial tissue, and it's called stratified squamous epithelium. Remember that about the epidermis. It is stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified means it's multiple layers. Squamous means it's the shape, right? So it's flattened, right? So it's multiple layers of these flattened cells, and we can clearly see there's different layers right here of the epidermis, right? And so I also need you to remember the epidermis, the layers of it, right? From superficial down to deep, okay? And so you'll hear that, you know, the memory acronym that they'll use where it's, so looking at the first letter, so let me do it in blue, C, L, G, S, B, it all comes after stratum, right? So they'll be like, come, let's get sun burned. Why do they think of that? Don't ask me, okay? But I guess it does help. Nonetheless, remember these different layers of the epidermis, okay? Also, I want you to remember that stratum basale layer, right? That's going to be the deepest layer, right? It's going to contain those melanocytes, and it's also going to contain these Merkel cells, right? And that's going to be one of those nervous system type of tissue, okay? So you're going to have neural supply in your epidermis layer. You're also going to find it elsewhere too, right? And I'm going to come back to the other slide. You're going to find neural supply in your epidermis. You'll find it like down here in the reticular layer by that lamellar corpuscle. You'll also find it in this papillary layer, right? The tactile corpuscle. So you'll find nervous tissue all throughout the skin, okay? Let me go back for 1 second to mention thick skin versus thin skin. Thin skin is 4 layers. All right, that's found on most of the body. But you're going to find thick skin on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Why? Because it's going to have that stratum lucidum layer. Thick skin has the stratum lucidum layer. Okay? Everywhere else, so like on the back of your hand, for example, it won't have that. Right? It'll only have the stratum corneum, the stratum basale, right? Spinosum. Lord, my brain. Granulosum, okay? Remember these different layers, okay? But again, only the stratum lucidum will only be found in thick skin, okay? And that's going to be that glassy, glossy type of layer. That's why your palms of your hands and the soles of your feet like look light, basically, okay? So, also remember that cutaneous membrane. So we know the epidermis is made up of epithelial tissue. The dermis is made up of connective tissue. When we're looking at the dermis, right, we're going to have a papillary layer and a reticular layer. Remember that papillary layer, which is going to be that top layer up here, right, the top layer, that's going to consist of loose connective tissue, okay? Whereas the reticular layer, which is going to be deep to the dermis, is going to consist of dense, irregular connective tissue, okay? Also want you to look at that erector pili muscle. That erector pili muscle will be able to be erected, and that allows your hair to stand up. And this is going to be made up of like smooth muscle, okay? So remember that. And then, you have hair on most places of the body. You're going to have these fine hairs that's going to cover the general surface of the body. These are going to be those villus hairs. Okay, these are going to be those villus hairs. And again, these are just fine hairs that cover the general surface of the body. Okay. And let me just simply end with the different organ systems that we have in the body. Integumentary system that we talked about, the skin providing protection. The skeletal system, right? We tend to talk about that, especially in week 2, right? And so the skeletal system consists of the bones, right? Giving you structure, giving you support, giving you protection. We have the muscular system, right? So remember, the muscular system is going to provide movement, right? It's going to pull on bones to produce movement, right? It also helps with heat, right? Things like that. Also the nervous system. The nervous system is going to be able to conduct those electrical impulses and be able to coordinate body responses very, very quickly. We also have the endocrine system. The endocrine system is going to be able to produce hormones and coordinate body responses, but on a slower level base compared to the nervous system. We have the cardiovascular system, right? The circulatory system, right? That includes the heart, blood vessels, and the blood. And that's going to be able to circulate, pump around and circulate oxygenated, nutrient-rich blood and be able to take waste away from your cells. The lymphatic system right here is going to contain those lymphatic organs, right? And that's going to be able to mature, right? Grow and mature those immune cells and coordinate an immune response to protect us against any type of pathogenic, right, microorganism, or even protect us against our own defected self cells like cancer cells, right? We have the respiratory system, right? The respiratory system is going to be important for like pH balance and also gas exchange, right? We have the digestive system, right, to be able to take in nutrients and excrete waste ultimately. We have the urinary system. The urinary system has a lot of different functions, right? Be able to produce the urine, right? Concentrate the urine, be able to modulate our body's extracellular fluid composition, right? We also synthesize some hormones in the kidneys. We also help with blood pressure regulation. So the urinary system does a lot. And then, of course, the reproductive system, right? Our ability to reproduce and create new generations of us, right? That was the lecture quiz review. Happy studies. Let me know if you have any questions, okay?